This is a very weird patch in which Second Dinner does many of the things that I've asked them to do in the past, and yet I still come away from this patch feeling a little bit unfulfilled. Let's take a look at what happened. Rocket&Groot is losing a point of power. This is one of the most played cards in the game, or has been, one of the sort of 5 best-in-slot options that typically make up a lot of good mid-range pile decks. And I think Rocket&Groot is a cool and unique card that does some very specific things, but yeah, I can see this being a very worthwhile nerf given the status that it had as a generic best-in-slot 3-drop, and I think we have seen in the past that Second Dinner is very willing to take aim at things that are generic best-in-slot. And so this is a very solid nerf, in my opinion. I like it. I really do wonder about this card's utility, because a lot of what Rocket&Groot brought to the table was that it was sort of, if you had priority, it was an effective follow-up to Iron Patriot that was like a 3-5 if you had prio, or more depending on how many cards they played, that could also move out of that Patriot lane later, which sort of made it this generically excellent thing. When it comes to Iron Patriot cards, I think that 3-4 versus 3-5 is actually the line, because most people are playing 3-5-ish type stuff in this game right now. So if you want to be winning an Iron Patriot lane, you have to be playing something of that size as well. This makes this card notably worse at that use case. It also makes the card much worse the later you draw it. I think Rocket&Groot is actually not necessarily going to fall off, but is going to be meaningfully worse because of this, because so much of what 3-drops are is defined by the Iron Patriot, or the ability to trigger an Iron Patriot, and it is defined in relation to other 3-drops due to that, and due to the general nature of what putting a card in your deck entails. I think that this could be a good thing for cards like Copycat, for cards like Speed, that might end up being generic best-in-slot in decks that are just looking for a good 3. Those are cards that are already pretty good and now are losing the thing that was preventing them from being that best-in-slot. What I really want to know is this card going to be actively bad? Because this is a really good case study for me on what I would like to describe as the Nocturne effect. If anyone remembers when Nocturne went from 3-5 to 3-4 and just became immediately unplayed, I have a theory that the gap from a good 3-drop to a bad 3-drop is very, very small. And this is a card that, you know, you could see this as going from a 3-5 to a 3-4, right? Like, that is a reasonable thing to describe this as, but unlike Nocturne, this card scales upwards in very powerful ways. I do think it's reasonable to say this card was too strong. The scaling on it is very good, and I also think that this is a good nerf in a general sense because it takes aim at one of the more generically applicable cards in this metagame and says, all right, let's get rid of that. In addition, I think it's good that they're reducing the amount of move in the metagame, and I don't mean move as in the move archetype, I mean cards like this and Vision. When those cards are best in slot, it makes late game turns complex and weird, and I think that that is a thing that is worth reducing in the game when you can. If you're going to be playing a card that is elite in terms of the numbers it produces for its slot, that card should also probably not move. Modok going to 5-7 is actually a change I would describe myself as disappointed in. And that is because I think that if I were in charge of balancing things, what I would be doing is aiming the nerfs at specifically the Bullseye discard deck, rather than at discard as an archetype in general. Because Modok is a card that is played in Khonshu discard, I personally would have left it alone. I would have aimed nerfs at maybe 3-2 Bullseye or something with Dakin, things of that nature, like just something other than the card that is played in every discard deck, because to me, it's very specifically one discard deck that is arguably problematic. And I think this is also probably a good time to talk about Bullseye. I feel as though a lot of people complain about it, and there are reasonable complaints to make about the Bullseye discard deck, that it feels more like playing against a deck than it does like playing against a person, that its combo nature means that it scales too high and its matchups are too polarized for it to be a fun thing to be in the metagame, that it's just been here for 3 months, and that's kind of annoying. There's good arguments against it, and I would be in favor of like 3-2ing a bullseye or something like that. But what I don't like is when a card like Modok, who is like, I want to be clear, I think the Khonshu Apocalypse Dracula version of the discard deck is worse than the bullseye version of the discard deck. And so for that reason, I'm sad that it's taking splash damage, because I don't know that that's a deck that can afford to take splash damage. I would like to keep that diversity of archetypes within the discard umbrella alive by aiming nerfs at the one I think is actually problematic. I do not know if this belief is shared among people at Second Dinner. Maybe they think that just the overall play rate of discard cards is too high. When I looked at play rate data in preparation for this video, Modok and Blade were actually pretty high. Like, there are a lot of people doing stuff like that. It makes sense. Like, maybe that is what they care about more so than being granular about specific decks being problems at high infinite. I could understand that. I do think that this is a little bit of a bad thing to do, though. Like, I personally am not in favor of hitting Modok as opposed to hitting the more specific cards. I generally am someone who likes to see decks like discard around, though. Like, I have what I think you could reasonably describe as a bias for decks that are these sort of easy to explain and understand and unique things. I know people think of me as the mid-range pile guy, but when it comes to, like, game balance and what my ideal metagame looks like, it looks a lot more like, oh, this is the destroy deck, this is the discard deck, this is the surfer deck. Decks that are like meaningfully identifiable from each other rather than just sort of, you know, the season passler. Like, I play what I play because it's good. I'm not going to sit here and pretend otherwise, but an ideal metagame for me has more decks that are doing meaningfully different things and play meaningfully differently, even if they arrive at the same place, because Marvel Snap is a game where everything is about points, right? And so I think that I am a little biased here, but I wouldn't have hit Modok. I would have aimed sort of very specifically at bullseye stuff instead. They grouped these changes together, and I think that's really interesting. This is, of course, the first Ghost Rider getting an extra point of power going up to 2/6, and I think that is also revealing as to like why they would target Modok in this case, because they're buffing Ghost Rider. They're saying, we want you to be playing more with this. We want you to be doing more like Gore Khonshu stuff. And I think that's really interesting because, like, the Gore Khonshu stuff has a naturally terrible matchup into anything that's actually, like, discarding their own cards, right? So nerfing Modok is a way of freeing up space for people to play, like, Moon Knight Gore Khonshu and not feel really stupid when their Moon Knight Black Bolt deck or whatever ends up helping their opponent. And so I think that's a really interesting thing to do. And that, in that context, again, I'm reading into it here. Like, this is not like an explicit thing as far as I can tell. But that's what I look at and I see, oh, okay, maybe that is a very smart thing. Maybe I'm overreacting to the Modok nerf in a vacuum, and what I'm not seeing is that they're trying to clear up space for a Khonshu first Ghost Rider deck to exist without randomly instantly losing to 10% of the metagame that is playing cards that want to get discarded. Maybe that's what's happening here. This is really interesting, though, because I don't know how much bigger this card can legally get. Like, it's just, I don't actually know how much larger they're allowed to make this card. Like, at some point, it just becomes, like, a problem for, like, anything that can turn off text boxes. And so this is like, all right, you know, that's, like, a pretty damn good card. Like, that's just, like, a number that is pretty good. But I do think that it's almost like the numbers on this don't actually matter too much in the larger sense, because what this actually says is discard a Gore. This says discard a Gore for your Khonshu, your Hela, whatever it is. And so the numbers on it, like, they can be relevant, but they mostly will not be to whether or not the thing is that it is doing is viable. If that ends up making sense, it could be a very good thing. And I do think that the nerf to Modok is almost as good for decks like Moon Knight that are going to be doing stuff like this as the buff to this. Maybe better if it gets people to stop playing discard for basically any amount of time. Discard's constant presence in the metagame is a downward force on decks like anything playing, you know, a Moon Knight first Ghost Rider package. It just sort of makes them unpleasant to exist. And so I do think that maybe even on like day one, we could be seeing something like Moon Knight actually showing up. I did mention when Khonshu came out that like we would eventually get a chance to see if those builds of the deck were functional, because they were not functional when everyone else was playing discard. They can't be functional when everyone else is playing discard. Maybe we'll finally get that chance. One of the things that really sticks out to me about this patch is how many of the cards in it are cards that I really wanted to see buffed, and then how little it excites me when I look at them actually getting buffed. And I think part of that is like, I look at the person that I was like a year ago, right? When Ultron and Claw got buffed, and I was making these videos about like, here are a bunch of cards you can buff second dinner. And a lot of the thing back then was like, I think you can go back and take these Series 1 cards and add like a point of power to them, and they will be like reasonably playable. But now I feel like maybe they have to add 2 points of power to stuff. And so I kind of expect a lot of the reaction to this patch to be like, shrug, nothing burger, nothing actually changed. When in fact, these cards did get strong, but they might have not gotten strong enough to actually be viable. I think Devil Dinosaur is a great example here. Devil Dinosaur is a card that I think they could make 5/5, and that would make it maybe a card that is worth playing and investigating and looking at. But at 5/4, I'm just not sure it actually hits that bar. I do think that, again, we're seeing some of the benefit of the buff to Enchantress, where it sort of frees them up to like make more of these early pool ongoing cards a little bit stronger. I think it is good that we're still reaping dividends from that, because I know they care a lot about the pool 1 metagame, and if 4/6 Enchantress is a relevant card, which it definitely is, then they have room to make cards like Dino a little bit stronger. I just wonder if this card isn't being held back a bit by the fact that it is in Series 1, because I don't actually think that it's all that different from something like a Ronin, for example. And I think it would be a little bit of a bad comparison with Ronin if they were both the same, but like, why can't Ronin be a 5/6 and this can't be a 5/5, you know? This is a card that I love. I love Devil Dinosaur. I really, really do. I'm not optimistic this makes Devil Dinosaur playable. Maybe there's a world in which we can pull it off and try to make this stuff actually happen, but a lot of the way that decks that are built around created cards work right now is they focus very heavily on cheap created cards, which makes sense, especially because you're playing Victoria Hand in a lot of them. And the more you're focused on cheap created cards, that means you're playing a lot of cards out of your hand on the later turns of the game. That's a good thing to be doing, which means that by the time the game ends, maybe you only have 3 cards in your hand, and that's not a recipe for a good Devil Dinosaur deck. Now, maybe it's an incorrect assumption that all of these buffs should be immediately impacting the metagame. Maybe it's just fine that they're buffing these cards, and that's just a good thing that they're going back and they're saying, hey, Series 1 card, let's make it a little bit stronger. It might not be the perfect time for it right now, but in a world where that time ever actually comes, it will be prepared for that. Maybe that's good. But I do think that it's weird how often they do a thing I've asked them to do. And they have a whole patch full of stuff like this, which, spoiler alert, they do. There's a whole patch full of stuff like this. There's more stuff to talk about, right? Like, but I come away from it feeling like it didn't matter because it didn't impact the metagame now. And I wonder if they're in sort of a catch-22, where if they make changes aggressively to impact the metagame now and make people feel the feel of a patch happening, then they end up running the risk of making these cards too strong, and that's just not a thing that they actually want to do. But if they play it safe, people feel like nothing actually changed. And I see that feedback a lot. Here's another one. Like, this is a thing that's like, oh yeah, that's free. You probably should have done that a while ago. That's great. Bishop going to 3/2. Love it. Great. Awesome. Is that enough to make him playable? Like, no. I kind of think that if you wanted to make Bishop playable, you make him like a 2/0 or something. Like, this is now a card that has been so outclassed. And like, I'm someone who's nostalgic for the days when I used to play like Angela and Devil Dinosaur and Bishop, and like, these were the cards that I was playing, and that was awesome. And I think that, like, again, 1 point of power does matter to Bishop a lot. But like, if you really wanted to push this is a card that I feel like, what if you made it a 3/3, right? Like, then I'd be really looking at it as like, this is a really, really, really good card. Even at 3/2, I think people are like gonna be a little too low on this card, but you have to balance the fact that it can scale high with the fact that it's usually gonna be pretty terrible late. But there are decks in this metagame, and I especially kind of like Bishop in light of this, that are going to be playing things like Mysterio, that are going to be interested in like playing a lot of cards, doing things like that. And I think especially Bishop is an interesting buff in the context of, I kind of expect Strange Supreme to come out. And when Strange, well, obviously he's going to come out, but like I kind of expect Strange Supreme to come out and then people to play Mysterio with him. And I think that that is a deck that could actually really use another scaler. Like it actually is very interested in that. So a world where you go like Squirrel Girl turn 1, Strange Supreme turn 2, Bishop turn 3, Mysterio stuff turn 4, like that's the kind of thing where it's like if Bishop was a 3/3, I'd be like really looking hard at it. And because he's a 3/2, I think I'm looking a little less hard at it. I hate to repeat myself, but this is another card where it's like, I think you can 3/3 this. I think you can very safely 3/3 this. Patriot to 3/2, like, I guess the thing I keep running up against is like, the difference between 1 and 2 power in a Marvel Snap game is actually very low. Whereas the difference between like, I don't know, 4 and 5 power is actually very high. And it's hard for me to explain exactly why that is, but here's my best shot. 1 and 2 power are basically always gonna be equaled out by a 1-drop, right? Like that's sort of what it is, right? Like you play a 3/2, okay, they played a Zabu here. And yes, of course, you're getting power from other parts of Patriot, but on the Patriot lane, this is a card that takes up a spot and it has 2 power. And I think that like that's sort of like the baseline for a card that does something else, right? Like Zabu does the same thing, right? Like it is a card that takes up a spot, has 2 power, but it costs less. It costs a lot less, and it does, I don't think you could say arguably more, but it does have other utility. Nobody actually plays Misty Knight, right? Like that 2 power plus something good is sort of the bar to be in a good deck, right? And so when I think of like the cards like this, and then I think of like the difference between Rocket and Groot and say Copycat now after Rocket and Groot's nerf, part of it is the immediacy of following up Iron Patriot, but part of it is also like, is this a worthwhile expenditure of your board space, right? And Patriot's power is so wrapped up in his ability that his own body going from 1 to 2 doesn't feel very relevant to what the deck is going to be doing. Maybe you'll win one more game out of 100 because your Patriot Ultron lane is bigger, but on the whole, the dynamics of the deck are going to remain exactly the same, and the dynamics of the deck currently are not very favorable for it. And so when you look at like something that would be meaningful for this card, I keep looking at it and it's like, what if it was a 3/3? Because suddenly I feel like the gap between 2 and 3 is actually very big. Like when you look at like how many good 2/2s have we ever had? It's not a very high number. And then you look at something like Loki, who was like kind of played at 2/2. He goes to 1/2. Everyone's like, oh my God, this is crazy. But it's not, because it's still only 2 power for the board space, right? And I think that ultimately, like 2 rounds to 0 the same way that 1 rounds to 0. In the sense that like it's not literally 0, but it is such a minimal impact that you will not notice it very often. And that's how I feel about this Patriot, where it's like, yeah, you should do this, but I think, again, it's like you're 1 power off if you wanted to make me seriously think about it. Last up is Redwing. And again, we talked about like the difference between 1 and 2 not feeling like a lot, and the difference between 4 and 5 feeling like a lot. I do think that while Redwing going to this number is like, that is really relevant, I am struck by the fact that like they felt like it was safe to do this, because 3/5 is a really potent stat line. And I think that 3/5 to me is sort of the gold standard of 3s. If you are 3/5 and you're doing something else good, you're probably worth doing. And so this is a card that has massive, massive upside, and it just got a premium stat line. And I really can't overstate, again, just how big the difference between 3/5 and 3/4 actually feels when you play the game. 5 is sort of where I start feeling like I have invested something meaningful in this lane. Redwing is such a specific card, though. And while I do think there are already good decks, or good enough to play decks that play Redwing, they're definitely not the kind of decks that care greatly about having good rate on their 3s. They're combo decks, and it'll help them, but it's not like a major priority. This is not a card that is getting played in decks that care deeply about like Iron Patriot, for example. Maybe they are. Maybe we can do that now. Maybe we can do like a small Redwing package where he's just good enough on value as a 3/5 for us to just generally be interested in, yeah, I'll play Redwing and then I'll like move him with a Ghost Spider or something and get a free guy and he's a 3/5. Maybe that can happen. The problem with that is that you're now investing another card in making this happen, and that seems a little less valuable to me. But if we ever get like some better enablers for moves or whatever, things like that, maybe this does end up being a genuinely impactful change. I do think that this is notable, but I'm not sure it's going to make Redwing decks all that much better. I hope that it'll encourage people to try different types of Redwing decks, though. So all in all, I kind of expect the reaction to this patch to be, nothing changed. And I think that there are going to be a couple reasons for that. If something did change, it'll be a sort of play rate downtick in terms of discard. I think that the Modok nerf will definitely make people take a look at that deck and be like, maybe I'll try something else. I don't think it'll actually be a meaningful impact on that deck. So what I think is that maybe people will look at it and try different stuff for a few days, but I don't think it'll actually meaningfully make the decks all that much worse, and then people will eventually be back to discard. But we have seen in the past, just the optics of a card getting nerfed makes people switch decks off of it. I don't think that that's nearly enough to justify dropping discard, especially the better bullseye version of it. The deck is still going to be perfectly fine, but it is relevant. And in terms of Rocket&Groot, I expect a lot of cards that were previously like second or third, cards like Speed, cards like Copycat, to start seeing a lot more play in that context, because Rocket&Groot is now going to be a little bit worse at winning those Iron Patriot lanes in those good cards piles, which are so prevalent throughout the metagame right now. There is one card that is worth talking about in the context of what we're talking about here that did not get nerfed, and that is Sam Wilson. I've been thinking a lot about how to deal with Sam Wilson, and I just actually finished having a really long conversation with some other high-level players about what the preferred methods of nerfing this card would be. To me, the worst possible method of nerfing this card would be to take the power off of the shield. I think it would be bad game design for Sam Wilson's shield, the one part of the card that happens every game, to be changed into a negative unless you draw Sam Wilson. I think that would be bad. What I am open to in terms of changes to Sam Wilson that make sense to me: take a power off of him seems free. Take 2 power off of him might be a little harsh. Cut his scaling in some way. Things of that nature seem very clear to me as a possible thing to do. I also think that it is notable that Sam Wilson is not overpowered in the way people react to. I think that I've gotten way more comments about Discard being overpowered or Mr. Negative being overpowered than Sam Wilson being overpowered. And I think he is like a clearly better card and deck than both of those. There's another card that's probably worth highlighting that I think is likely a balance outlier that is not being addressed here for various reasons. One of which is probably play rate, and that card is Scream. I think she is probably the best 2-drop in the game, and that includes Sam Wilson, at least in the context of what she does. Sam Wilson is far more generically applicable. I think Scream is probably stronger when you play her in her deck. And I think that anything at that level of power is the kind of thing that I would be keeping an eye on if I were them. It's definitely notable to me that when I was doing research for this video, I took a look at play rates, and Scream has like a 9% play rate at top infinite, but from like 30 to 100, it's like below 4%. And then from like 70 to 100, it's like below 5%, I believe. And what I'm really trying to tell you here is if you are struggling to get infinite, just play Scream. Just go do that. You'll get there. It'll be fine. It's a very powerful thing to be doing. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.